Thanks. Over to you.
Thank you very much, euan, and thanks for the invitation, and thank you all for coming along. Hopefully you can understand my rather thick Australian accent, so I'll do my best to try and talk clearly. As many of you might know, currently there's quite a focus on predators worldwide for important reasons. We know that predators affect a whole range of species, both through actually killing and eating animals directly, but also the effects they have in terms of actually modifying the behaviour of other species as well, in terms of them trying to avoid interactions with predators. And this is an example of a predator from where I live in Australia. This is the dingo, which is a close relation to the wolf, arrived in Australia about 3,500 to 5,000 years ago. And it's a very controversial species. Some people basically hate dingoes, other people like dingoes for the ecological benefits they have. But it's a very difficult species to manage, and obviously has kind of parallels, I guess, with many predators, including those in Europe. So think about things like bears, even wolves in parts of Europe as well. So it's quite interesting in that sense. Interest in trophic cascades and predators, as I was saying, has really increased dramatically in the last few years. And this is just a graph here from the early 90s through to now, showing the amount of research on trophic cascades. So you can clearly see there's a really strong emphasis and interest in trophic cascades and the importance of those. And I guess capping that off, in 2011, a paper came out in Science by Jim Estes and et al., really kind of talking, I guess, or summarising the important effects that predators have. Traditionally, I think it's fair to say that ecologically, many people think that ecosystems and habitats are really kind of affected by what's called bottom-up processes, so productivity, so the nutrients available in the systems, how light, I guess, affects plant growth and so forth. But many people have been arguing recently, in fact, that predators have a much more significant role than we've ever given them credit for. And that includes not just regulating things like herbivore numbers, but influencing things like disease dynamics, even climate change itself. So people have been saying that we really need to focus a lot more on looking at predators. And there's classic examples of what happens when you remove predators from ecosystems. Here's 3 examples here, going from the top to the bottom. We have an example from the Arctic, Central America, and this is Yellowstone National Park, which is probably the classic example that many people know about. And you can see when you have on the left-hand side, the predator is absent, contrasting with when they're present in the same system, you have very different outcomes in terms of the vegetation, the amount of cover, and even the structure. You can see the difference between structure here when the predator is absent or present. And that's basically because they're regulating herbivores. So they're killing, they're removing herbivores from that system, which then of course affects plant growth and the structure of those plant communities, etc., which then of course affects the biodiversity which lives in those systems, because of course species have relationships with the vegetation themselves. So you can see by taking out one species in particular, be that the Arctic fox, jaguars or cougars, or in this case wolves, you can really have a big effect on the system overall. So we know, therefore, that predators are important globally, and obviously that many of those species might be recognisable to you. But the problem, of course, is that in many parts of the world, humans have been doing their best job to get rid of predators, maybe for obvious reasons sometimes. If you're in a kayak, which is only about 3 metres long, and you've got a 4-metre great white trailing behind you, it's probably not a very nice situation to be in. But having said that, I think the scales are well and truly favoured for humans in terms of what's happening. So around the world, about 95 to 99% of mammalian carnivores have really disappeared. So they've either gone extinct completely, or their populations have been dramatically reduced. And even in the oceans, there's a very similar situation occurring. So large sharks, large predatory species have declined by upwards of 90% in many parts of the world. And these have really big flow-on effects right throughout the system. From that Science paper, there's a really nice quote, I think, which kind of encapsulated the importance of what happens when you lose predators from a system. And it's not just that you lose the effect of the predator and its interaction with one species, but what Daniel Jansen is saying here basically is you lose all the interactions they have, some of which are very, very hard to measure directly. So if you lose a predator from a system, of course you lose all the behavioural effects that predator also has on all the other species with which it interacts and the flow-on effects it has. So you lose more than just that species itself. But another really interesting thing that people are starting to appreciate even more is that this affects us. It's not just that you go out into the wild and you sort of look at wolves and how they might affect deer or elk and things like that, but this actually comes back to affect us. And there's a really interesting case study here from Africa where a decrease in the numbers of large predators, in this case leopards and lions, has led to a huge increase in olive baboons. Has anyone here been to Africa at all? Anyone at all? Have you seen baboons in the wild? Okay, so they're very large animals and very, very aggressive animals. I would almost go as far as to say that if I had a choice between taking on a baboon, a male baboon, and a lion, I'd choose the lion. Olive baboons, male baboons are very aggressive animals. And what's happened is, in the absence of lions and leopards, olive baboon numbers can increase dramatically. And there's two effects of that. One is that olive baboons are coming into closer contact with humans. And there's kind of anecdotal stories of children, as an example, being harassed on their way to school. So you can think of it as a human example there. They can't get to school because the olive baboon's kind of chasing them away. And of course, if you're a little kid, you've got a big baboon chasing you, that's a pretty scary thing. The other thing that's happening is disease transmission. So olive baboons can actually transmit disease back to humans, so in this case, trematode parasites. So you can see by losing a top predator from the system, that's having an actual strong impact on humans. So it's not just these are things that are happening in the wild, they're actually happening at the interface between humans and wildlife. Another interaction which people haven't really kind of understood very well until recently is the effects of predators on other predators. So not just predators eating things, but actually predators controlling other predatory species. This is probably the classic example here. This is from California, where they looked at interactions between coyotes, cats, and songbirds. And the other thing that was interesting here was there was an effect of habitat fragmentation. So as housing developments increased in California, patches of habitat got smaller and smaller, they got more fragmented, and coyotes disappear. As coyotes disappear, cat numbers increase. So this concept here is basically called mesopredator release, but essentially the concept is my enemy's enemy is my friend. What that means is for songbirds, in the presence of coyotes, songbirds do better because you actually have less cats, because coyotes control cats. If you get rid of coyotes, you have more cats, and you have a lot less songbirds. So this concept of mesopredator release has really kind of come to prominence recently. Another good example here is from Sweden with wolves and lynx and red fox. So as pastoralism or kind of farming, if you like, increased from the 1830s through to sort of early 20th century, people started killing wolves and lynx in big numbers, and there was a corresponding increase. Here you can see this is red fox numbers here. The triangles represent lynx and wolves, and you can see that as lynx and wolves started to decline quite dramatically, red foxes increased in their numbers associated with that wolf and lynx decline. Interestingly, there's a nice kind of end to that story, if you like. Recently, many of you might know that lynx and wolves have started to recolonise parts of Sweden, and in those areas where they are, red foxes have now started coming back down again. So that's pretty good evidence that wolves and lynx were actually controlling these populations of red foxes. And just to kind of show it overall, this is a sort of a meta-analysis, if you like, of sorts that I did with a colleague of mine, just looking at what happens when you take an apex predator out of the system, what amount of effect, if you like, does it have on the mesopredator in that same system. So on the y-axis here, we just have change in abundance, so a unit of abundance for each situation. So these are all different case studies. All I want you to take out of that is you can see that even with a really small increase in the apex predator, you often have huge decreases in the mesopredator numbers. So you don't actually need that many top predators in a system to actually dramatically decrease the mesopredator abundance. So the flip side, of course, is if you take out those apex predators, you get a huge increase in mesopredator numbers. Interestingly though, you'll also note you have some situations though where with an increase in the apex predator, you have the decline of the smaller mesopredator, but some of them actually increase, which talks about the complexity of a system. So it may be in this situation that this species here may actually be being controlled by another predator within the same system, but by the apex predator controlling one, it actually makes it better for another. So you can't generalise and say that this predator will kill all different predators. It may actually selectively target other predators in the same system, which might change the dynamics of which predators occur in which areas and in what abundance. So it's quite complex. I'll touch on that a bit more later on, so don't sort of get too worried about trying to understand what's going on there, but I just want to sort of show you that really small numbers of apex predators have a big effect. So a quick outline of what I want to talk about today. First I want to quickly talk about biodiversity loss in general and why it's important to understand the roles of predators. Then I'm going to quickly sort of touch on some of the results from my work in Australia on looking at the ecological roles and the importance of predators. And then the question is, where to now? And I sort of pose that question because we actually have a lot of information already about predators from different parts of the world. But the problem is, how do you actually use predators to our advantage, given that humans often don't actually like having predators in the same landscapes? So what are the challenges and what can we do about it? This is probably very familiar to you all. As you know, we have a big problem with species loss right around the world. Species are disappearing at alarming rates. Some estimates say between 100 or 10,000 times the background rate of extinction. So well and truly above what is normal, if you like. And many people kind of have the vision that this is why we're losing species. So you go to Dubai and you see it's been heavily modified, habitat loss, and you lose the corresponding species associated with that development. What's interesting from an Australian perspective is we indeed have lost lots of species. By world standards, you might not know this, but Australia is probably the worst for conservation of mammals anywhere in the world. So in the last 200 years, Australia has lost over 20 native mammal species, which is a terrifying record. But what's even more scary right now is that this is a picture here of Kakadu National Park. Has anyone here actually been to Australia? No one? Okay, so there's a beautiful pristine landscape in the north of Australia called Kakadu National Park, which is a Commonwealth, so it's a very well funded, very well resourced national park. And as you can see, you would think, well, that would be kind of ecological nirvana, if you like, for animals. They should be able to exist there quite easily. But animals are disappearing from this landscape at alarming rates. So you look at that and it's not actually a result of human impact per se. Something else is going on, and the question is why? Why are we losing species from landscapes like that? And more, as I said, are on the way. The reason for that kind of necessitates, if you like, understanding a bit of history about what happened in Australia. So about 200 years ago, obviously Europeans arrived in Australia and brought with them the red fox and the feral cat, or the house cat, if you like. And they, by far, have had the biggest impact on the fauna. There's been other effects like habitat fragmentation, domestic livestock having impacts, habitat fragmentation, all those things, fire. But if you look at the kind of overall picture for Australia, the main reason why we've lost so many of our native animals is the impacts of red foxes and cats in particular. And so people are sort of asking the question now, well, why are we losing species currently as well, and what can we do about it? So this is a species here, that's the black-footed tree rat. It's a nice native rat from Australia, about 1 kilo in weight, so it's quite a big rat. But many of our native mammals, unfortunately, are now only seen like this, which are paintings of Gould. So Gould was a famous artist who painted many of our native fauna, and unfortunately a lot of our native mammals can only be seen in books. And we're trying to prevent that. So people are looking for solutions for conservation. How can we actually stop more of these declines occurring? And I'm going to touch on sort of how we might go about doing that. Which brings us sort of to the main focus of my talk, which is, what is the role for mainland Australia's last top predator? And I say last because it wasn't actually that long ago when Australia had a whole range of predators on the mainland part of Australia. So we had the Philistine, or the Tasmanian tiger, you might have heard about. We also had a marsupial lion, so we had our own version of the lion. We also had the Tasmanian devil, but on the mainland part of Australia. So for those of you who know sort of Australia well, you obviously have Tasmania, which is an island part of Australia. But then we also have the mainland, the much larger part. But Tasmanian devils have disappeared from the main part of Australia about somewhere between 500 to 5,000 years ago. Philistines disappeared around the same time, and the marsupial lion a lot earlier. But the point is, with all of that now, is we really have no large top predators, other than one, which is the dingo, based up in the top right corner there. And the dingo, as I said, is controversial, having only arrived in Australia about 3,500 to 5,000 years ago. So some people consider the species native, some people consider it introduced. In my mind, that really doesn't matter. What actually matters is, what is the ecological role of this predator? What function is it performing, given that we don't have all these other predators present? So we sort of made some predictions about what the dingo might be doing in Australia. So in many parts of Australia, it's used for cattle and sheep grazing, and dingoes can have effects on in a number of different ways. So one of the things that dingoes can do is control kangaroo numbers by killing basically kangaroos and eating kangaroos, keeping their populations lower. So I guess an equivalent thing would be wolves, controlling deer numbers in parts of Europe. The other thing that dingoes do, of course, is impact cattle. So So they can have an impact by killing young calves and impacting the stock that way, which of course grazies don't like very much. But importantly, by dingoes controlling kangaroos, that affects vegetation conditions. So the amount of vegetation, but also the type of vegetation that's present. And what's interesting is that some farmers have realised actually that dingoes can control kangaroo numbers, which can actually be indirectly beneficial for cattle, because what happens is by controlling kangaroo numbers, you have more vegetation, which means cattle have more food to eat and they're in better condition. And the typical time that cattle are actually attacked by dingoes is when the mothers are weakened. So they're weaker, they can't actually defend themselves very well against attack from dingoes, and they're less likely therefore to fend away a dingo trying to attack its calf. But if there's lots of grass and they're well fed and they're very strong, they'll actually defend themselves against dingoes. So there's a positive feedback going there. The other thing that dingoes do is control mesopredators, so that's smaller predator numbers, in this case foxes and cats, which has a benefit for smaller vertebrates, so small mammals, reptiles, birds, as well as invertebrates of course, because they're also affecting vegetation conditions. So you can see dingoes in this case have a very important role in a large number of ways in the Australian landscape. So we want to test this idea out. But how do you do this? Whoops, too fast. Go back one if I can. Yeah. How do you do this? It's very, very hard to experimentally control dingo numbers, kangaroo numbers, everything else at a large enough scale to make it useful for managers to kind of get some information about it. So what we did was we chose pairs of sites. So each one of these two dots is a place where dingoes were controlled, so that is they were shot, they were poisoned, they were essentially removed from the area. The other dot is where dingoes were left alone. I've got two large cattle stations, so two places basically very large. And when I say large, I'm talking about sort of 3 million acres, so they're big. But everything else is the same other than that. So the habitat's the same, the number of cattle is relatively the same. Everything's the same other than do they kill dingoes or do they leave them alone. So we did that in a number of different parts of Australia, up in the tropics and also in the arid zone, to see what are the differences between places where dingoes are controlled and where they're not, but also is that actually affected by different environmental parts of Australia, so high rainfall, low rainfall, etc. And that kind of gives you an example of what the different habitats look like. And to do that, we basically used camera traps, and we did driven surveys as well, for both dingoes themselves, but also kangaroos, small mammals, etc. So here's an example here of one of the videos. These are dingoes here. And I think this highlights quite nicely the benefit of using camera traps. Before camera traps and the invention of camera traps, we really couldn't do the type of work that we're doing now. So we can get information on not only what the number of dingoes are, but what they're actually doing in terms of behaviour, whether there's any differences between different dingoes, etc. We get a lot of information from camera traps that we couldn't otherwise get. So a very handy resource. So moving quickly now on to results. What are the effects of dingoes on herbivores, in this case kangaroos, but also how does that affect plants? So this is some work that I did mostly actually as part of my PhD, that also shows the effects of dingoes quite clearly. So this is just total abundance of kangaroo numbers. Baited is places where dingoes are controlled. So when I say baited, that means poison baited for dingoes. And this is places where dingoes are left alone. And what you can see is, in unbaited places for dingoes, you have almost double the abundance of kangaroo numbers. So you get rid of dingoes and you have double the amount of herbivores in that same system. So a big effect there. What's also interesting though is that dingoes are actually changing the community composition of those macropods, so macropods being kangaroos. We have 4 species here. This is the smallest species, and this is probably the second smallest species, and this one here is the largest species. What's interesting to note there is that for the species which have a small in body size, and females in kangaroos, just to point out, are much smaller than the males, those species are heavily affected by dingoes. So you can see in unbaited sites, you have far fewer individuals than you do at baited sites. But for the eastern grey kangaroo, which is the largest species, there's no effect at all. So it doesn't appear that the dingo is actually affecting them very much at all, maybe because they're too big to be affected. But what does this mean for plant cover? So this is a graph here just showing kangaroo abundance going across on the x-axis, and this is plant cover on the y-axis. Each one of these dots is 2 sites. So it's a contrast, so dividing a baited site by an unbaited site. If there was no relationship at all, you'd expect the dots to be sitting along this line and there'd be no trend at all. But what you can quite clearly see is that as kangaroo abundance increases, that's basically as dingoes are being more controlled, you can see that plant cover itself decreases quite dramatically. So you can see that dingoes are having an effect not only on herbivores, but therefore on the plant cover itself as well. And the way they do this, we think, is by affecting females in particular. So this is a graph here showing the number of females in a population per 100 adults for a species. So as I said before, the males are very large. This is a male Antilopine wallaroo, and these are the females. So a male might be 60 kilos, a female might be on average 25 to 30 kilos. So there's a big difference in the body size of the males and the females. And what you can see here is in the baited sites, so again where dingoes are being removed, you have a much higher proportion of females in the population than you do where dingoes are not being controlled. So that has an effect on population growth. Of course, if you have more females in the population, you can have much higher population growth. Males tend not to be able to make very many babies, so the females do all the work. Now I'm going to quickly move on to cats and dingoes. I don't know if you guys know Larson over here very well, but Larson is a fairly famous cartoonist, and I think he probably represents quite nicely the general interaction between dogs and cats. And here's one of our videos just of cats, just to show you that we did actually see cats. Cats are notoriously hard to work on. They're incredibly cryptic, very shy, very, very hard to get good data on. But camera traps again have made our life a little bit easier. What I want to also show you though is, this is kind of the image that people have of top predators, that they kill other predators. So this case, this is a photo taken from a camera trap. This is a dingo, and hopefully you can see it. That's a cat sitting in the dingo's mouth. So that's pretty good evidence right there that dingoes are in fact controlling feral cat numbers. But I want to quickly move on to some of the other effects that people don't think about very much. So yes, dingoes do kill cats, so that directly affects their abundance. But one of the other things that dingoes do is, because they kill cats, cats don't like being where dingoes are. Cats avoid dingoes. So there's a behavioural effect. And I'm going to show this here. And I'll quickly talk you through this. The interesting thing about this graph here is that you can see there's a triangular relationship here. And something that's sort of only recently started to be appreciated is that many relationships between species are not classic kind of a linear relationship. So you don't see kind of a clean linear relationship. It's triangular. So what that means is that as dingo numbers increase, when you have very, very high dingo numbers, you'll always have low cat numbers. But when you have low dingo numbers, you may also have low cat numbers because other things in the environment are not suitable for cats, or you could also have really high cat numbers. But essentially all that graph is showing is that dingoes set an upper limit to how many cats you can have in that habitat. So this is numbers of dingoes per night at a camera trapping station. So where the camera trap was, how many cats did we see, how many dingoes did we see through time. The other really important thing about this is that you can see that there's a little bit of a threshold going on. So in low dingo numbers, you have a lot of variation in the total number of cat numbers, but once you get to about 1 dingo per night, you have almost no cats. So you can see there's an effect there of the activity of the dingo. So when they're really active, you don't get any cats at all. And I'll show you now some other really interesting data. This is the numbers of dingoes and the number of feral cats through time. And we have two different charts, so I'll talk you through this. This is a 24-hour period going from sunset through to sunrise. If we look at the top one first, you can see that basically we have feral cats in the yellow bars and dingoes in the dark bars. Dingoes are mostly active sort of at dawn and dusk. There's a peak of activity. And when dingoes are sort of in the landscape still, yes, cats are active around sunset, but a lot of their activity is centred around later in the night. Okay, so they're avoiding the peak activity period of dingoes for good reason. If you think about it, if you know that there's a predator out there that's going to kill you, you're going to do your best job to be active when they're not active themselves. So you're trying to avoid them in time. So they're avoiding them in space. If you remember the camera trapping data before, so parts of the habitat, but they're also actually avoiding them in time. Now what's interesting with that is that you can see when you move to places where dingoes are removed, so these are the beta places, cats actually change their activity period. So you can see most of their activity now is actually just around sunset or post-sunset period. And that's really important in Australia because in many of our environments, in the desert in particular, but also tropical environments, most of the activity of small mammals and reptiles is just after dark. Because it's warm, they can move around a lot, the insects are active, so they can get food really easily. So there's a big peak in activity of small mammals just after dusk. And the cats can obviously take advantage of that by hunting in that period. And they're going to get, obviously, a lot more prey more easily in that period. So what's happening, we think, is that by losing dingoes, you're actually making it easier for cats to hunt their prey more efficiently. Okay, so there's a really important behavioural effect there as well of dingoes on cats. And I'm not sure how well you sort of know the Australian wildlife, but one of the species that's been heavily affected in Australia is called the bilby. It's kind of a rabbit-sized marsupial about this big. In most of Australia it's gone completely extinct, but in small parts it still holds on. But there's been attempts to get bilby numbers increasing again, and what happened here was they had some enclosures where they had bilbies doing quite well, and the fence was compromised, cats got in, and they killed almost all of the bilbies within a couple of weeks. So we know that cats can have a big effect on native marsupials. So the effect of dingoes, therefore, on cats is a really important one if we want to actually conserve our biodiversity. The problem with all of this is that what happens in Australia, I'm not sure about in Europe so much, but what happens in Australia a lot is that we remove species without actually thinking too much about the effects that has on other species. So in terms of pest management, we're really kind of ignoring the complexity of interactions between other species. And that's really a problem. So, you know, if you take dingoes out, what are the effects on other species? Or if you take foxes out, what are the effects on other species? We really need to sort of think about the whole system together rather than just choosing to manage one species in isolation. And I can highlight this even using a European example here. So this is some work I was involved with colleagues over here, but basically in Fennoscandia you have the top predators being the lynx and the wolf, and they indirectly benefit smaller prey species, so in this case hares, black grouse, etc. But they control numbers of red foxes quite easily. Interestingly, in Sweden, as I showed you earlier on before, lynx and wolves were basically removed from the system, which allowed red foxes to increase in numbers. But we also have other problematic species to deal with, in this case the American mink, which is an invasive species. And what we actually know now is that red foxes actually do a really good job of controlling mink. So you take wolves and lynx out, the red fox actually becomes, in a sense, the top predator, and it actually controls mink. Now the problem with that, of course, is that as wolves and lynx are coming back in, we might hypothesise that actually will lower red fox numbers, which may actually indirectly increase mink numbers. So you can see that it's really problematic to just think of one species and say, well, yeah, let's just put wolves back because that's a good idea. You actually have to think about how the whole system is going to work. Because you can obviously say, well, getting rid of red foxes is really good for the Arctic fox, because we know that red foxes exclude the Arctic fox, but what about the effects they have on the mink? You have to weigh up all these positive and negative effects that predators have within a system, not just themselves. And just highlight this is another study from Australia. Basically what happened was we had mammals that were disappearing. People went in there and controlled cats and foxes by using poison. Initially there was a really good result. Small native mammals increased dramatically in their numbers, but very shortly after that there was a big crash in the numbers of mammals. I said controlled cats and foxes, I meant to say just foxes. What happened was, following the control of foxes, there was a big increase in cats and reptiles, in this case snakes, so pythons. And mammals then crashed again. So this is probably another example of mesopredator links. Foxes may have actually been controlling cats and other reptiles, but then when foxes were removed, which we thought was a good idea, they actually had a negative effect on the small mammals. And I'll show you this here. This is radio tracking data. This is just data which determines basically the reasons for death for those woylies in this case, which is a burrowing bettles marsupial bat